Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Horus Heresy lore. We are still on the Thousand Suns, and I suspect we're gonna be here for a while. This book really is just chock full of interesting information. Now, the sneaky little serpentine, slithery, slabbery tentacle monster has got Magnus in its grip. Oh no, whatever will happen. But before we get to the tentacle monster, we get another little interesting piece of information. The entity that is living beneath the mountain of Agoru has apparently, either through some cunning plan or by good old-fashioned coincidence, planted its slithery, slimy little ass right on top of a desolate webway portal. Now, this particular portal was ruined to some extent, but even then, Magnus managed to draw some meaning for it. Not only did he immediately understand what it was, which is impressive in and of itself, I mean, he's looking at an alien piece of tech and he's like, aha, it's a webway portal. Duh. Well, it is Magnus, I guess. He also managed to memorize millions of different entrances and exits to this webway network. And he must have suspected that something like this was down here, because he didn't even seem surprised. He was just like, oh yeah, I figured this was here. And he figures also that the Emperor would be very pleased to hear of this, at the very least pleased enough to ignore Magnus's smaller transgressions, like ignoring poor little Rusty Boy, for example. Which means Magnus has absolutely no fucking clue what the Emperor is doing on Terra. Now, to be fair, we kind of already knew this, or at the very least had an inclination that that was the case, but this is confirmation that Magnus, who was, well, intended to serve a fairly central part in all of this, actually didn't know diddly dick about what the Emperor was planning. But that, of course, is entirely unimportant. The interesting part here is the snack, the slippery snack. Yes. So, Tentacle Monster turns out to be a slippery snake, who appears in front of Magnus and goes like, hello, I'm a snake. And Magnus just kind of looks at it like, yeah, I know. Again, he doesn't seem to give a shit. I love this scene because of the utter and complete just no care from Magnus. He doesn't give a shit. It's a malignant demon entity that's popping in front of him like a feathered serpent and going like, hello. And he's just like, yay, serpent. That's adorable. Very original. And the snake just kind of goes like, yeah, I know, right? But this isn't me. This is you doing it. Magnus is... This conversation says so much about Magnus. He is so utterly fucking convinced that there's absolutely no way he could ever receive any information he doesn't know already. He treats anything the snake has to say with complete and utter disregard, which, you know, you probably should. It is a demon, after all. By the way, another nice little tidbit. Apparently, the Denizens of the Warp are really fond of the word demon. They love it. They're like, oh, yes, it's a wonderful word. It's a word that gives power to fear. Precisely what we want. Yes. Which is pretty kawaii in of itself. I fucking love this demon entity because there's just so much sass in it. It's just there, like, not giving a shit. It's Magnus the Red in front of it, who could kill it with just a twist of his wrist, and it's just giving him sass, like, yeah, I'm not lying to you, buddy. This is actually what's gonna happen to you, and you are so fucking arrogant, so fucking full of yourself, you are not gonna see this coming, and one day, you're gonna look back at me, the little snack, and you're gonna go like, fuck me, I was an idiot. I mean, the snake literally tells Magnus that he didn't defeat the malignant warp entity who held the fate of his legion in its claws and shit. It literally tells him, you bested nothing. And Magnus is just like, it's lying to me. I fucking love that. That is so beautiful. Because it's what Magnus would do. Of course he wouldn't put any stock whatsoever in the word of some random-ass warp entity. He couldn't care less. And the fact that he couldn't care less is what's going to ensure his fall. It is beautiful. It really is. There is one thing that really bothers me about this, though. Because nothing the snake said was untrue, and Magnus does have a certain amount of knowledge about demons, and even when some of the stuff the serpent says turns out to be true, he still doesn't think twice about it until it is way too late. You'd think somebody that knows about as much about demons as Magnus would eventually realize that sometimes the best lie is the one that is spiced with the truth. You really would think somebody of Magnus's intelligence, and perhaps more importantly familiarity with demons, might possibly know about this, but apparently not. Oh, and also, I missed this the first time I went through this book, but when the snake asks Magnus, wouldn't you at least let me tempt you first before murdering me? And Magnus goes like, I already have power. What possible use could I have of yours? The snake simply says, your power is a borrowed power. Is the wriggly-tiggly tentacle thingy suggesting that maybe, just maybe, Magnus is not actually a psyker? Or at the very least, not anywhere near as powerful a psyker as he is, but rather, he, instead of using his own psychic power, is essentially using Tzeentch's power. A rather inflammatory little note, but considering the fact that he ended up on a world that was completely steeped in chaos power, not entirely impossible. Plus, it would explain why his psychic powers didn't really grow all that much after he became Primarch. They grew to a certain extent, but nowhere near as much. I mean, if you were a demon prince, you'd think that your mastery of the warp would increase rather dramatically, and yet Demon Primarch Magnus doesn't seem, psychically speaking, to be all that much more powerful than regular Magnus. I mean, he had to fist fight Guilliman the good old-fashioned way in the Gathering Storm books. Now, granted, the Gathering Storm books are also pants-on-head backwards retarded, so that might be another explanation for why he simply didn't pop Guilliman's head with an aneurysm or something, but it's something to bear in mind anyways. Eventually, the great Magnus decided to kill the demon before it murdered all of the Astartes he'd brought with him. Very generous of the Crimson King, that. And thusly ended the threat of the squiggly, wriggly tentacle monster. Somewhat anticlimactic, really, but then again, it is Magnus versus tentacle monster, a fairly unfair fight, everything considered. With this, the connection to the webway was also severed, but, as previously mentioned, Magnus has already gathered the information he needed. And with this as well, the need for the mountain on Aguru was more or less completed. The mountain had been pretty much entirely corrupted anyway, and was practically useless at this point. There is a mention, however, that the power was now flowing out of Aguru normally, but it was a clean power. Again, I'm not particularly trusting on the Thousand Suns' interpretation of clean and unclean warp energy. Something tells me that the citizens of Aguru are going to have a problem with mutation relatively soon, but hey, details. This did, however, mean that Magnus was now free to wander off with the Space Wolves and finally help his brother. I'm sure Russ will be super happy to see Magnus arrive just a few fucking decades late, but hey, again, details. The war that Russ was wanting help for, by the way, was against a rather fascinating little human culture that apparently has some interesting relationships with a low-intelligence Xenos species known as Shrieks. These things are not intelligent de facto, so it's not full-on Xenos collaboration, but nor are they mere beasts, so that's a little bit of an interesting one. Apparently they had figured that the best thing to do was to insult Russ when he came to offer them peace, and that worked out really, really well for them, as their entire empire was burned to the fucking ground by the Thousand Suns and the Space Wolves, to absolutely nobody's surprise. Though, before we get into that war in more detail, we get another really interesting little tidbit that reinforces some of my previous speculation about the tutelaries. So, Otha Virdmake, a Space Wolf Psyker, an Ahriman, had gotten along really, really well. They had apparently been, by both legions, kind of ordered to get along with the other and share some of their secrets, in the case of the Thousand Suns, in an effort to convince the Space Wolves that they weren't all crazed psychers, and from the Space Wolves' side, probably an attempt to try and understand this legion and figure out if they were really quite as, witchy as they certainly seemed. The two got along pretty damn well, and they exchanged a lot of different information. Virdmake, for example, teaching Ahriman how to read runes, and Ahriman introducing Virdmake to the concept of tutelaries, a concept of which he was to begin with rather skeptical towards. Who'da thunk it? The practice of summoning demons for tuition purposes. Eventually, however, Ahriman managed to convince him that the tutelaries were little different than the wolves that accompanied the space wolves. They were familiars. I'm frankly surprised Otha would go along with that, but apparently he did. The wolf itself, however, knew better, and whenever Ahriman would summon his tutelary, the wolf would bar its fang at it and go like, "Rawr, rawr, demon, demon, please kill it, master, it's bad, it's bad." And Otha Virdmake's like, "No, bad dog, it's perfectly fine, it's a warp entity, teaching my brother Legion its tricks, what could possibly go wrong?" Virdmake. You're remarkably receptive to bullshit for a Space Wolf rune priest, aren't you? Anyways, let us return to the war. So, this was a gathering of mini empires, 6 of them to be precise if memory serves, that were loosely tied together by trade treaties, common interest, and also common defense pacts. If one was to be attacked, then the others would come to the defense of the one attacked, which is a fairly good way of making a decently lasting alliance. These various empires were also connected via a combined form of monarchy known as the Phoenix Court, where the various leaders of the empires would gather and discuss various matters of import. The system had been discovered by the Word-Bearers, which, well, I mean, it could be worse. It could have been the World Eaters. That would have been worse, but the Word-Bearers is a close second, and Lorgar decided to initiate diplomatic communications with the people of these empires. He had, according to Imperial records, made several overtures to try and entice them in joining the Empire. Oddly enough, when Ahriman began looking into it, he couldn't find any mentions of what exactly these overtures were, which is rather interesting. Now, the chronological order here is a little bit confused, but I think this is after the Emperor had chastised Lorgar, which means that in all due likelihood, this is after Lorgar and his legion went full batshit. Now, this is not really confirmed, as there are mentions in the book of the Word-Bearers carving out representations of the Emperor out of entire mountain ranges, which seems rather zealous, but at the same time, judging by the relative time, as best as I can determine it, this is probably after his chastisement, and they might be doing this specifically to piss off the other 2 legions. And by God, it worked. The Thousand Sons were not particularly fond of this. They considered this to be in clear violation of the Emperor's edict, and, well, it was. And as for the Space Wolves, yeah, they probably didn't take it all that nicely either. Additionally, the Word-Bearers were not doing anything to try and ingratiate themselves with the local population. In fact, they had deemed vast swaths of the population to be unclean heretics, and had begun murdering the whole bloody lot of them, going so far as to bombard entire continents from orbit with good old-fashioned napalm strikes, or, well, in this case, promethium, which is about the same thing, except slightly worse. Now, yes, I will grant you that that does sound like the actions of religious zealots, definitely, but before this, the Word-Bearers had acted very differently. Before their chastisement, they were more like, Jehovah's Witnesses who would go, "Hello, do you have some time to talk about Jesus?" Now, granted, they would try to convince you by showing you ridiculously overblown propaganda and carving out literally entire mountain ranges to resemble the Emperor, but at least they'd try to convince you, and in fact, they would take great pains to convince the population rather than subjugate the population. Hell, one of the reasons the Emperor chose to chastigate them in the first place was because they were taking too long in conquering places, because they were so thorough, and here, they are far less, do you want to hear about Jesus, and far more, hello, this is a flamethrower. if you don't convert now, I'm going to use it on you. And hell, even that is a little bit too generous, because they didn't even give the population the option to convert, they just burned them right off the bat. And it's not like these were Xeno's population either. Now, granted, they had diverted a fair bit from what was considered human standard, but the Adeptus biologists had decided that they were acceptably within human standards, e.g., they had mutated, sure, yeah, but they were still considered humans, not extreme mutations or a Xeno species. As such, the rather extreme approach by the word bearers seems a bit much. There is also a mention that Magnus had expected to find treasure troves of information, and eventually he did find a fair bit, but apparently the word-bearers had been quite busy burning every single library they came across. Now again, this is not an action that would be entirely foreign to a somewhat zealous bunch of people. But I just find it interesting that Magnus, and he should probably know considering his whole sneak peeking into the future stuff, was expecting to find genuinely interesting information here, and at the same time, the word-bearers were burning everything? I'm wondering if there might not have been some actually useful information here that might have taught Magnus that maybe, just maybe, he should be a little bit more careful around the demons? When speaking of that, apparently the Thousand Sons themselves, and Magnus to some extent, had also undergone quite the transformation. Previous to this, they had been very, very careful around Brother Legions, making sure not to appear too, witchcrafty, too suspicious, and yet here, apparently, the Corvidae, Ahriman's cult, were using their ability to see into the future to help the Imperial war effort, and they were doing this openly. They were using their powers in battle with virtually no restraint, and in complete open, in full view of Imperial army elements, they were using their psychic powers to do stuff like cleaning their bolt rifles, something that they would do previously, but they'd make damn sure nobody else would see it. This, I think, backs up my theory that the power on Ogoru somehow influenced and corrupted the Legion, because, again, nothing had really happened to make them feel this comfortable, especially not around two legions like the Space Wolves and the Word Bearers. I mean, these are not exactly open-minded legions. Granted, yes, Ahriman had had some dealings with Oath of Virmake, and the two legions had come to a kind of understanding, but nothing anywhere close to the point where the Thousand Sons were like, yeah, no, sure, the Space Wolves are fine with this. This is not a problem. They're pro-psychers now. No, nothing like that. And Magnus, oh, he was not holding back in the slightest. He had literally started ripping mountains apart and reporting it to Rust. Like, hey, bro, look at what I can do. This is quite the radical departure from the Thousand Sons' initial idea of slowly convincing people. You know, like we talked about in the last episode, where Magnus had this grand idea of slowly but surely convincing the Imperium that they weren't all batshit insane psychers. I really think that whatever was in Agoru had a lot more of an effect on the Legion than the Legion was aware of. It might be that this was even part of Lorgar's plan at this point. Ahriman decides to read the aura of a dying soldier, and discovers that he is confused at why the Imperium is attacking them. Again, I'm pretty damn sure this is after Lorgar went full batshit, and maybe this was a way of trying to entice the Thousand Sons into continuing to use their powers more uncontrolledly, as there's also mention that the Corvidae's powers had recently been buoyed up and been increased. Which, again, I mean, all of this sounds so suspicious, which again is really why I'm surprised Magnus is not noticing any of this. I mean, again, the demon didn't lie to him, not at a single point, and now he's seeing all of this strange shit happening. They're attacking a planet filled with people who don't know why they're being attacked, and if Ahriman noticed this, you can bet your lily-livered little ass that Magnus bloody did. At the same time, Lorgar is burning all of his books, and Magnus must be noticing that his legion is acting more and more in the open. He must understand that he's antagonizing Russ by doing this, and considering what's about to happen, yeah, again, I'm really surprised that Magnus is not putting two and two together here. But the entire point about Magnus being a retard aside, the war was going pretty well, considering 3 legions are gangbanging the place, that's not surprising. And the last enemy redoubt is about to be attacked. We get a small scene between Magnus and Russ, which is heartwarming? I don't really know. Apparently the two kinda like each other and kinda don't, which is interesting, considering they should have some differences of opinion, and especially considering what eventually happened between the two. Anyways, there's a very interesting mention here when they're attacking the last city. So, the Thousand Sons defend their dropship via various psychic means, via the Kain shields, via the Corvidae looking into the future, via attacks upon the munitions by detonating them, etc. There was one very interesting mention, though. The Corvidae mentioned that they used their tutelaries to pull strands of the future for them to see. They would then send suggestions as to what needs to be done to Magnus, and Magnus's superhuman mind would then filter through all of the suggestions made by the various specialized Corvidae captains, and then send out instructions to the various ships. Bank right, dodge left, missile on your tail, airburst 12 o'clock, etc, etc, etc. What I react to here is the tutelaries are the ones that bring up these strands of the future to their masters. Could it possibly be that the tutelaries are manipulating the Thousand Sons via this? Now, I know this is some serious conspiracy bullshit here, but what if the tutelaries, being warp entities, have more of a connection to the future than the Thousand Sons at this point, seeing as the greater warp entities are clearly in control of how much into the future they can see? Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to cloud the Corvidae's eyes, and definitely wouldn't be able to fuck with the Eldar's ability to read the future, which they have done on multiple occasions. See the Fulgrim book for that one. Maybe, just maybe, they are able to pick out individuals within the Thousand Sons that would be problems for them in the future, and accidentally not relay the information that might save their lives? We're getting a bit far into theory crafting here, but Ahriman himself did say that this was not a perfect solution and that casualties did still happen. I'm just very, very suspicious about anything involving the tutelaries, because, well, once a demon, always a demon. Another quite interesting little note is that the Thousand Sons' charm offensive towards remembrances seems to have taken a rather fascinating turn. Now, apparently, they're allowing the remembrances to come down to the battlefield with them. Now, on one hand, I guess that's what they would want. On the other, wowzers. I don't really know whether or not I'd say that was a particularly good idea. Again, the Thousand Sons have tried to hide their psychic powers all the way up until now, and now they are bringing remembrances down with them onto the battlefield where they are using their psychic powers actively. What the hell happened? Whatever little mind rape bug who bored its fleshy little tentacles deep into the soft, squishy brains of the Thousand Sons back in Orgoru must be doing one hell of a job indeed, because they have gone full crazy. And hell, even if you argue that this is a part of their arrogance, which it definitely is, because they're like, yeah, no, you're civilians, you'll be fine in a war zone, because we're the Thousand Sons, we can protect you with magical doodads and shit. Even then, and even considering that Magnus is trying to win these people over, this is not the way to do it. Winning somebody over would be like what Ahriman is doing to Lemuel, slowly teaching him the mysteries, not dumping him in a war zone, and then showing him Thousand Son legionaries cooking humans, of all things, alive with lightning. At least if this was a Xenos war, I could kinda get it, but these are humans. You're now showing the people you want to convince just how horribly you can murder other humans. Stupid. And speaking of bloody bad ideas, so, Apparently, the Thousand Sons figured that the command wafers given to them by the Mechanicus weren't good enough, and so they'd been doing a little tinkering with their servitors. Now, for those of you who do not know, a command wafer is essentially call it a punch card, a data card, that is inserted into the servitors to give it a range of actions depending upon external and internal stimuli. For example, if it is getting shot at, the reaction would be to shoot back. It can be incredibly simple, or it can be incredibly complex. Essentially, it is old-school programming, where you are telling the servitor to do X if Y happens, and so on and so on. The best programmers can make extremely complicated and very responsive combat software, but in many cases, these combat softwares can quite easily be exploited once you know what you're looking for. The Thousand Sons, however, always knowing best, figured that was too silly, and there was no reason why the Mechanicus would use such a ancient analog device. Instead, they insert little slivers from a special cave beneath Prospero that grows magical crystals. These magical crystals allowed the controller to directly interface with the minds of the servitors and essentially think for them, allowing the Thousand Son in question to use his psychic powers to essentially puppeteer these servitors, or in other words, necromancy! Yay! What could possibly go wrong? Introducing psychoactive material to the brains of servitors. Not to mention, there is a funny little hint of heresy going on here as well. One of the psychers attached to the Thousand Sons, the lady who can touch things and know their history, decided to touch one of their servitors, and instead of the usual cold mechanical precision, she sensed something a little bit uncomfortable, namely the urge to brutally and violently murder things. Misa thinks there's more than a tiny bit of warp influence inside of these reflective crystals. Misa indeed thinks that there might just be a hint of good old-fashioned corn in them. See, this is the problem with the Thousand Sons. They are again so entirely convinced that they know exactly what's going to happen if they do A, without having the faintest fucking clue what B is. This is going to bite them in the ass rather viciously at some point, isn't it? And speaking of bitten backsides, it is time once again for me to bite all of you. Here's an ad. That probably was remarkably boring, but look at it on the bright side. At least when I put an ad randomly in the video, it usually means that something interesting about to happen, and it most certainly holds true this time as well, since suddenly all of the Thousand Sons bend over and scream in agony as a psychic yelp, yes, I'm going to be using the word yelp, you'll understand soon enough, echoes through the whole battle zone. It was so bad that it actually killed outright many of the more psychically sensitive amongst the Thousand Sons. As for the origins of this psychic yelp, it was obviously Leman Russ himself. I guess this is a new superpower he has. He can yell really loudly and psychic, which is certainly an interesting thing. One he completely forgets about later, but hey, details. Anywho, all that is clear at the moment is that something, somewhere, has urinated in Leman Russ's cornflakes, and he is none too pleased about it. It turns out, to absolutely no one's surprise, that the urine in aforementioned breakfast cereal had been delivered by Magnus. He had ordered his Thousand Sons to seize the main library of Phoenix Crag, the very same library that Russ had intended to turn into a festive bonfire. As it happened, elements of a Thousand Sons had reached the library first, before then getting engaged by the Space Wolves under Amladoy Skarsson. I really hope he falls out of the story soon, because I really don't like his name. It triggers me a lot as a Scandinavian, but hey, details. The Thousand Sons, obviously, is not going to let the Space Wolves make their little bonfire. And at the same time, the Space Wolves are not going to let the Thousand Sons rob all of the books, which they think are, probably heretical, and let's be honest here, it's probably a better than even odds that they are. Arman and his formations reached the library just as Skarsson was preparing to attack the Thousand Sons, which, I gotta say, that's rather drastic of the Space Wolves. Granted, they're not the most finely controlled of chapters, or well, legions at this point, to be honest, but I still find this to be a little bit 0 to 100. The 1,000 tons got to the library first. We don't want them to be at the library, so we're going to try and murder them. Now, granted, these legions are not on the friendliest of terms, but that escalated damn quickly. Especially also considering the fact that Magnus himself was at the Phoenix crack. This means that the Space Wolves were currently launching an attack on a Primarch. I don't like this. I mean, this is just too bloody far, too bloody fast. Yes, these two legions don't like each other, but heavens forbid, they're literally fighting each other for an enemy library now, without even an attempt at diplomacy? It really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but hey, what else is new? The Space Wolves attack the Thousand Sons. Magnus gives strict orders to not kill any of them. Instead, they are to deploy Kayan shields to hold them at bay, and deploy biomancy to fuck with their innards, essentially freaking out all of their neurological responses and making them fall over that way rather than killing them. They don't have anything against killing their puppies, which I think is a bit fucking cruel, but hey, the Thousand Sons are clearly not fans of Peter, as they fry the poor little puppies with lightning. Doesn't do diddly dick to stop the Space Wolves, granted, but after a relatively short, although vicious, engagement, the Space Wolves are stopped with a combination of Kayan shields and biomancy, which renders them unable to continue the fight. In this engagement, neither side takes any casualties, apparently. Though it does take place on a massive fuck-off bridge, so, you know, one or two might have fallen over the edge and might have been bashed into tiny squealing pieces on the rocks very, very far below, but, yeah, collateral damage, essentially. And speaking of collateral damage, this is when things get really interesting. Yes, Legion fighting Legion, that's not the interesting part. The really crazy part happens when one of the Thousand Sons, one by the name of Hastar, gets a little bit too excited with releasing his powers and is overtaken by it. That whole flesh change thing that was about to wipe out the entire Legion, and that Magnus apparently fixed, well, it's just made itself a little bit of a reappearance. And the description sounds an awful lot like a good old-fashioned Zinchian spawn. Again, I suspect that their little trials and tribulations on Agoru might have unlocked what Magnus temporarily seized away in his little play-fighting session with what was, quite likely, Zinch. The flesh change also started to affect the other Thousand Son Legionnaires, but they managed to insulate them against it before it made them into writhing, roiling little monstrosities, which is lucky for them. Magnus might have been about to do something to try and halt it, although at this point it had gone too far, but before he could, Leman Russ decided that the wriggly monstrosity did not need to be alive and put a giant bolt shell through its squiggly little torso, or head, or whatever that thing was at that point anyways. Magnus, however, was not particularly fond of Leman Russ's solution and was about to go and have a bit of a fight with the big lad when the third Primarch showed up via teleportation of all things. Now, of course, a teleportation like this, right into a battle zone, is risky, which makes me wonder what exactly Lorgar was playing at. Granted, it was a very, very dramatic entry, no doubt, but, also the least safe possible way he could get there. Not to mention, how did Lorgar even know they were fighting? So many questions, so few answers. And he told both of them to essentially take a chill pill and maybe not murder each other today, which is also rather interesting. If Lorgar really had tipped over to the dark side at this point, you'd think he would be all for Russ and Magnus ripping each other's faces off. Granted, he might be playing the long run here and thinking that In this case, right now, Russ would probably beat Magnus, and if that happens, he wouldn't be able to radicalize Magnus and his legion later on. It's a bit iffy, but I don't know. It seems odd on one hand for Lorgar to intervene right here and right now to stop them fighting, and at the same time you could potentially speculate that he didn't want them to fight yet. Again, I don't really see what he has to gain by that, but, well, here we are. The two are stopped successfully, and they banter a bit back and forth, and there is one interesting thing here. So, Lorgar asks Russ if his psykers really are all that different from the Thousand Sons, to which Russ, of course, answers, yes, of course they are. They are the storm seers, etc. Their power comes from the elements, which isn't technically true, but the interesting thing here is that Russ has kind of accidentally stumbled upon a point. The Thousand Sons use the power of the warp directly, and a lot of that power seems to come from a very, very sketchy entity, which means it is in all due likelihood inherently corrupt. The Space Wolves draw their power from the warp as well, yes, but they do not believe they draw it from the warp. In fact, they believe this is a natural force that they draw upon from the World Forge of Fenris, etc. That might actually be enough to insulate them from the powers of the warp. Again, remember, the warp can only do what we think it can do. If the Space Wolves are utterly convinced that this is not the power of the warp, but instead the power of Fenris, then as far as the warp is concerned, yep, sure, we'll go with that. And this is particularly interesting because this means that the more knowledge you actually have about the warp, the more likely you are to be corrupted by it. That would be a rather fascinating theory, wouldn't it? Not to mention, it would actually kind of explain one of the age-old questions, why people who try to harness the warp need to do so with metaphors and creating creatures within the warp, like the Eldar did. Basically, the more you know about the warp without rationalizing it in some way by creating your own gods, the more the warp corrupts you. I'm gonna have to delve a little bit more into this theory, but I think I might be onto something there. Anyways, Russ tells Magnus that I won't forget this and I'll get you someday, and Magnus tells him to go fuck himself, essentially, and then they wander their separate ways. Apparently, civil war had been avoided for now. Another interesting little mention, Lorgar mentions that Russ had had a bit of a rough and tumble tussle with the lion at some point, but now, apparently, they were the bestest of friends, which is rather interesting. I wonder what they were fighting about. I'm sure we'll find that out eventually as well. After these less than congenial events, Magnus wanders off and refuses to tell anybody where he's going. This is in space, by the way. He does leave the planet. He is not exactly happy with Russ, and Russ is not happy with him. He takes his fleet and simply wanders off himself without even so much as a by your leave. Rather rude, if you ask me. Magnus, however, is heading for Ulanor, which means that this fight must have happened relatively shortly before the Great Triumph at Ulanor. And with that piece of information, we can say for absolute sure now that this is after Lorgar went full-on heretical, so whatever he was doing on this planet, it probably wasn't nice. And speaking of not nice, that Thousand Son that has suddenly turned into a Zealotry spawn and tried to nobble his friends' heads off. He was brought back aboard the Thousand Son flagship at extreme secrecy, to nobody's bloody surprise, and was given a warrior's funeral. Magnus was not available for comment on this particular issue. Ahriman did eventually broach the subject when they were on Ulanor, asking if this really was the flesh change and why it could have happened. Ahriman himself seems to have rationalize this somewhat to himself in that this man could not control his own powers, but it's clear that he doesn't really believe his own rationale. Magnus explains it to Ahriman that it must have been a fluke mutation, a 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance that will never happen again. Ahriman is less than convinced, and I'm really wondering if Magnus himself is particularly convinced by this rather obvious lie. Then again, once more, I have to mention that it's possible that he is. Magnus might be so sure that he actually did save the Thousand Sons, and he certainly sounds it, that he really does think that this was an aberrant mutation. Seems spectacularly unlikely, but, well, coincidences do happen. But, well, perhaps not on quite this scale. Whilst on Ulanor, we do get a couple other interesting tidbits as well, like, for example, Constantine Valdor, one of the oldest, most venerable of the Custodes, was just entering the Custodes Order when Ahriman left Terra to join his legion, which means that Valdor is very, very old indeed, and considering he's still alive in 40k, that means that he's got to be well and truly over 10,000 years old at this point. Another interesting little tidbit, so the Tutelaries are clearly warp entities. We've established that much at this point. However, we've also established that they kind of, how shall we say, react strangely to certain things. The Space Wolves do not like them in the bloody slightest. We also know that they are not particularly well liked by many others, like, for example, with the Stormseer, who is rather suspicious of them. Now, the Tutelaries are mentioned to disappear once the Custodes show up. Now, there is a mention of the Sisters of Silence are somewhere nearby, trying to loiter just out of range of their spheres. I'm assuming this is because they want to try and not offend the Thousand Sons, because obviously, a Legion of Psykers might get a little bit nervous if there are anti-Psykers nearby. Might seem like a bit of a special precaution and all that. Obviously, the Thousand Sons notice them immediately anyway, but hey, that's not actually the point. The Silent Sisters seems to be out of range of their effects upon the Thousand Sons to try and hide themselves. This should mean that they should be out of range to suppress the Tutelaries. So, does this mean that the Tutelaries are afraid of the Custodes? It's a bit of a 50-50. They might just be too weak to be able to stand this relatively nearby the Sisters of Silence, which is very likely, or they might really be afraid of Custodes, which, considering their rather demonic nature, would probably not be too much of a stretch. Anyways, Magnus is waved through the control point where he runs into Mortarion, who is once again a sneaky little son of a bitch who just basically appears out of nowhere, in a way that even Korax would look at and go like, that's fucking cheating. Mortarion brings up a rather interesting little point though. So, Magnus starts by saying, isn't this a glorious event? 9 of the Emperor's sons gathered all in one place. This hasn't happened since long ago. And Mortarion says, rather interestingly, I know when it happened last, and the Emperor forbade us to ever speak of it again. Huh. Well now, that's rather fascinating. I am wondering if this couldn't be just a tiny little hint to the lost Primarchs. It sounds to me as if the Primarchs were gathered to either decide upon what to do with the lost Primarchs or possibly even to fight them directly. Now, the conversation gives away very little at all, and apparently the Emperor has sworn them all to secrecy, so I doubt we'll be getting any real information about that. And really, I hope we don't get any more information. I like the Lost Primarchs because they are mysterious, because they are a mystery, an unsolved thing in 40k. And at this point, I don't think they should reveal it, ever, because no matter what the answer is going to be a massive fucking disappointment in comparison to the mystery. Still doesn't mean that we can't have a little bit of fun at the occasional mention, though. I also like how Mortarion is like, ha ha ha, Magnus, you think the number 9 is significant? Silly little warlock. Considering he has ordered his personal bodyguard to never be more than 47 paces away from him. Yeah, I don't think Mortarion is entirely qualified to bitch at others for being a warlock. Hell, we all know that Mortarion is at some level a psyker. You don't just pop out of thin air without having some special skills. Why he would even bother trying to hide it from Magnus is beyond me, frankly. Hell, the walking corpse that is Mortarion even has the balls to lecture Magnus on diving too far and too fast into dark secrets, which is fucking rich, coming from Mortarion of all people. He even brings up his dad, a literal walking corpse demon, as a cautionary tale. I really don't think Mortarion of all people have any right to be lecturing anybody about delving too deep too fast, but the lesson is of course entirely lost on Magnus, who simply says that power cannot be good and cannot be evil. And in a way he's correct, but the thing is he has completely misunderstood again the warp. He compares the warp to Mortarion's pistol, saying that of course the pistol is a force for good in Mortarion's hands. If only you knew, Magnus. But in the hands of a villain it would be a tool for great evil. The difference is, of course, that the pistol is not sentient. The pistol can't just shoot somebody because it doesn't like the look of their face. The warp, however, while it might not be sentient in the way we would normally use the word, it does have certain agency, and as such, it is very, very different from a mere weapon like a pistol. This is, again, Magnus's rather basic and surprisingly simple misunderstanding. It kind of surprised me that nobody's pointed this out to him. You know, Big E just walking up and like, no, Magnus, that's silly. A pistol can't think for itself, but you know there are demons in the warp. Don't you think they might have some kind of intelligence? Magnus really annoys me as a character because he's so fucking smart, and yet he seems utterly and completely incapable of putting two and two together. And speaking of putting two and two together, Mortarion also informs Magnus that Russ had lodged an official complaint against the Thousand Sons' actions at the Phoenix Crag, which comes as a surprise to Magnus, and apparently even comes as a bit of a disappointment, which... Really, Magnus? You are amazingly clueless occasionally, you know that? Like, magically so, but anyways... This should be a fairly obvious thing. Russ sees Magnus use his sorcery against his legion, apparently also causing the death of some of them, and for some reason being really, really upset about Russ wanting to burn a library full of what was probably heretical texts. Of course he's gonna lodge a complaint. But far more interesting than that rather obvious piece of information is that Ahriman gets himself a vision of the Imperium as a great machine, with all of the various mechanisms and cogs working in perfect, uniform perpetuity, to enrich the entire Imperium and run forever and ever in perfect synchronuity. Except there is one piston that is beating slightly out of beat, and as its rhythm continues to deteriorate, it will eventually tear the machine apart. The piston is marked with a wolf's head, and it is surrounded by other pistons marked with icons of the various Primarchs. Ahriman seems to think this is a sign that the Space Wolves are about to do something very, very stupid, and you can kind of understand why. It's the wolf's head and the Space Wolves. Not particularly hard to put those two together, and definitely the Thousand Sons have reason to mistrust the Space Wolves, especially since they were just told that the Space Wolves had lodged a complaint against them. What Ahriman forgets, though, is that there is another legion that uses a wolf's head as an emblem. The Lunar Wolves. Now, to be entirely fair to Ahriman, I can kinda see why he would miss this. I mean, the Lunar Wolves, the Emperor's most respected and loyal legion, how could they possibly be doing anything out of sync with the Imperium? Hell, they are basically right now at what is soon to be the coronation ceremony of Horus Lupercal. It is entirely plausible and indeed logical that he would assume that this is the Space Wolves. Again, this is one of those beautiful little parts of Chaos's great plan here. They give them enough information wrapped in enough truth to allow their own biases to shape their opinions in just the right way that the gods want them to. It is quite delicious, really. And finally, after the coronation of Horus Lupercal, we get couple more interesting things. So, Magnus had of course discovered the webway network. He was very excited to tell father, and so he dinged him up on the good old-fashioned psychic telephone thingity-bob, and told Daddy, upon which Daddy said, "Yes, I know, son. In fact, I've known for bloody decades, but, I don't really know how to use it yet, so could you please not dig any further?" That was basically it. Magnus was a bit miffed at this. He was a bit miffed particularly by the fact that Big E basically told him, "Yeah, I got this covered. I've got a big plan for you soon, but I can't have you muddling with this just now, so please stay away from any and all things related to this," which undoubtedly did ruffle Magnus's pride just a little bit. And with that, I'll wrap up the second part. This is indeed gonna be a long one. I'm thinking I'll probably get it done in the third one, though, so soon, quote-unquote. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.